He rescued her from a blizzard, not knowing whose daughter she was. A few hours later, the truth hit like thunder. Can you guess who her father is? Subscribe so you don't miss new stories. Write in the comments. Would you tell me who you are in her shoes? The sky hung heavy with snow, the kind of winter sky that blanketed the world in quiet expectation, a pale gray expanse that blurred the horizon and dissolved time. Claire Holloway gripped the steering wheel of the rented SUV, her knuckles white as the tires crunched along the icy, winding roads of Vermont. The mountains loomed in the distance, disappearing and reappearing like ghosts behind drifting veils of snowfall. She hadn't told anyone where she was going. No calls to her mother's assistant, no emails to her father's secretary, no note left behind in the penthouse suite she had vacated that morning before dawn. Just her, the car, and the road. Finally free, finally alone. For 25 years, Claire had played the part. The polished daughter, the unwilling heiress, the pretty face in every magazine profile of Holloway Group, that sprawling empire of boutique fashion houses and retail chains. Her father had never asked if she wanted the role. He had assigned it. Groomed for the boardroom since she could walk in heels, expected to smile at gala events and deliver rehearsed lines to the press, Claire had spent years feeling like an accessory to someone else's legacy. But something inside her had shifted lately. Perhaps it was the exhaustion, perhaps the simmering need to find a life outside a last name. And so she had done something unthinkable. She had left. The GPS on the dashboard flickered and then died. The cell signal had already vanished miles ago, swallowed by the pine-covered slopes. A tremor of uncertainty passed through her, quickly suppressed. The road she followed, narrow and flanked by snowbanks, led to a cabin she had rented under a pseudonym. A week. That was all she needed. A week in silence to paint, to sleep, to remember what it was like to be a person and not a brand. The snow thickened. It fell in heavy curtains now, swirling in the SUV's headlights. Visibility dwindled. The road narrowed further as the elevation climbed. Then came the turn, too sharp, too slick. Her tires skidded on black ice hidden beneath the fresh powder. Claire gasped, braking too late. The SUV spun slightly and veered off the road, nose-diving into a drift. The engine choked and died. Silence followed, absolute and unnerving. Claire sat still, her breath catching in her throat. The heat blower coughed out a final gasp and went silent. Cold air crept through the seams of the door. She tried the ignition again. Nothing. She cursed under her breath and fumbled for her phone. No signal, no bars. The battery, already low from her refusal to check in with anyone, blinked red and died in her hand. A wave of fear pulsed through her, unexpected and primal. She opened the door and an icy wind slammed into her like a wall. She stepped into the snow, instantly knee-deep. The forest pressed in around her, vast and unwelcoming. Somewhere, surely, was a house, a cabin, a flicker of life. She began to walk, her boots sinking with every step, the cold biting through her coat. Snowflakes landed on her eyelashes, clung to her cheeks, crusted her scarf. The cold wasn't just cold, it was sentient, seeping into bone and thought alike. Her vision blurred. Her fingers grew numb. Each step felt heavier than the last. Minutes or hours blurred into one another until she no longer knew how far she had come. Then, through the storm, came a low mechanical hum, like a breath against the silence. A flicker of movement, a light. The snowmobile came from the north, a dark silhouette against the white. The driver wore black, helmet, jacket, gloves, faceless and fast. He slowed as he approached, cutting the engine beside her. Claire stumbled, nearly falling, and strong arms caught her. For a second, she thought she might pass out from the sheer relief. "You all right?" The voice was low, calm, American. She tried to nod, but her teeth were chattering too hard. He looked at her for a moment, as if assessing something, then swung off the vehicle and pulled off his helmet. Snow-streaked black hair, a firm jaw shadowed with a day's growth, and the kind of eyes that made her stop breathing for a moment. Slate gray, unreadable. "Come on," he said. "You'll freeze to death out here." She didn't argue. Her limbs obeyed more easily now that help had found her. He helped her onto the snowmobile behind him, his body warm through his jacket. As the engine roared back to life and they tore through the white, she pressed closer, grateful for the heat, grateful for the fact that someone, anyone, had found her before it was too late. The ride was swift, efficient. They cut through trees and hills until, finally, a house appeared through the snow. Secluded, modern, built of wood and glass, glowing from within like something out of a dream. He parked the snowmobile, helped her down again, and ushered her inside with a hand on the small of her back. The heat hit her like a wave. She blinked, dazed as he guided her into a vast open space that looked like a cathedral made of cedar and stone. A fire crackled in the hearth. The walls were lined with books, warm-toned furniture, subtle art. Not the sterile minimalism of wealth, but a curated calm. He disappeared and returned with a thick blanket and a mug of tea, which she accepted without question. He crouched beside her on the couch, not too close, and asked again, "What's your name?" She hesitated. Her instincts, honed from a lifetime of interviews and media training, told her to lie. "Claire," she said finally. "Just Claire." He nodded, not pressing for more. "I'm Grayson," he said. "Grayson Carter. Most call me Gray." The name meant nothing to her in that moment. Her thoughts were fogged by exhaustion, warmth, and the surreal calm of the space around her. She sipped the tea slowly, the heat returning to her limbs. He watched her without staring, a quiet presence that didn't demand anything. She noticed the way he moved, measured, efficient, the way people moved when they were used to silence. "Do you live here alone?" she asked. He nodded. "Most of the year. It's where I go when I don't want to be found." She smiled faintly. "Sounds perfect." They spoke little after that. He showed her to a guest room down the hall, spare but inviting. The bed was already made. She changed into the dry clothes he offered, flannel pants and a soft sweater, and crawled under the thick quilt, the day catching up to her all at once. Alone in the dark, she listened to the storm outside and the distant crackling of the fire. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't scrolling through a phone, wasn't answering calls, wasn't preparing for anyone's expectations. She didn't know who he really was, or why he lived in a house like this. But for the first time in her carefully choreographed life, none of it mattered. She slept deeply that night. When morning came, the storm had passed, but the snow remained, thick and endless. She woke to the smell of coffee and music, soft jazz drifting from the other room, and wondered if, just maybe, she had stepped out of one life and into the beginning of another. She stood at the window for a long time before breakfast, watching the trees bend beneath the snow. Somewhere behind her, footsteps approached. She didn't turn. She didn't have to. She knew it was him. Gray stood silently behind her, his reflection joining hers in the frosted glass. Outside, the world was quiet, but something was beginning to stir. The storm had passed, but its presence lingered in the heavy whiteness blanketing the world outside. Through the expansive windows of Gray Carter's secluded home, the woods looked like something out of a snow globe, pristine and suspended in time. Claire stood barefoot on the heated wooden floor, arms wrapped around herself as she watched the flakes drift lazily from a sky still caught between gray and silver. It was the kind of winter morning that asked nothing of the world except stillness. She had awoken to the aroma of coffee and the low, soulful hum of a saxophone. Jazz, classic, timeless. The kind of music that curled into the corners of a room and warmed it from the inside out. It was disarming, like everything else about this place. There was no rush, no schedule, no one knocking on the door with urgent requests or media inquiries. Only the sound of the fireplace, the rich smell of ground beans, and the quiet clink of dishes in the kitchen. Gray moved with the economy of someone accustomed to silence. He said little as he cooked, but his presence was calm, steady, and unexpectedly attentive. He served breakfast, simple scrambled eggs, toast, and black coffee, and they ate together at the long wooden table, where the windows framed the snow like a painting. "You sleep all right?" he asked between bites. Claire nodded, taking a sip from her mug. "Better than I have in weeks." He offered a small smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes but wasn't insincere. "Most people do here." They spoke sparingly, but the pauses were never awkward. There was a comfort in their shared quiet, a mutual understanding between two people who had grown used to being alone for different reasons. Claire found herself studying him in the flickering morning light. He was difficult to place. His age, his background, his intentions. He looked like someone who had seen more than he said, who carried a weight he didn't name. But it didn't frighten her. It intrigued her. After breakfast, she helped him clear the table, instinctively moving around his kitchen as if she belonged there. He didn't object. Instead, he handed her a dish towel and dried the plates she washed, standing beside her in a rhythm that felt oddly intimate. "You always live like this?" she asked, glancing sideways. He shrugged. "Here, yes, keeps things simple." "No family? No one waiting for you in the city?" "No," he said without hesitation. "I keep my distance." She didn't push. She understood the weight behind his words. In her world, distance was often the only form of self-preservation. Still, she couldn't shake the curiosity settling into her bones. There was something about him, something withheld, carefully guarded, and it made her want to know more. The day drifted gently. They moved through the house like two puzzle pieces, slowly circling one another, unsure yet if they fit. Gray showed her the library, a vast room lined with floor-to-ceiling shelves and a massive leather couch. Claire's eyes lit up. She traced the spines with her fingers, marveling at first editions, biographies, novels annotated in neat, spidery handwriting. "This is incredible," she murmured. "It's where I hide from the world," he replied. She found herself sinking into the couch with a book, legs curled beneath her, the fire crackling at her side. Gray sat across the room at a desk, scribbling something in a leather-bound notebook. Occasionally, their eyes would meet, and something unspoken would pass between them. Acknowledgement, curiosity, maybe even longing. When the sun dipped low, Gray lit more candles and opened a bottle of wine. The power flickered once, twice, and then gave out completely. They sat in the flickering glow of the hearth, the room bathed in amber and shadows. Claire laughed, surprised at the sound of it. "Well," she said, lifting her glass, "looks like we're snowed in for real." Gray smirked. "Good thing I've got plenty of wood and wine." They talked more freely then, the walls between them softening under the influence of candlelight and Cabernet. Claire told him about her love of painting, how she used to draw on napkins as a child when no one was watching. He listened, really listened, not the way people in her father's world did, calculating, transactional, but with a quiet attentiveness that made her feel seen. "And your family?" he asked finally. "They support the artist in you?" Claire hesitated. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. "Not exactly. They prefer results, numbers, titles." He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "Sounds familiar." Something in his voice struck her. She leaned forward, elbows on her knees. "Tell me something true," she said suddenly. "No small talk, no scripts, something you've never said out loud." He blinked, then gave a soft laugh, surprised, almost amused. But he didn't refuse. "I wish I didn't know how much power changes people," he said, "including me." The air between them shifted. Claire reached out, her hand brushing against his. Their fingers lingered, touching gently. The silence stretched, full of questions they hadn't dared ask. Gray's eyes dropped to her lips for a heartbeat, then back to her eyes. That night, with the wind howling outside and the world reduced to shadows and firelight, they kissed. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was slow, careful, like they were both testing the waters of something neither had expected. His hand cupped her cheek, thumb brushing her skin. She leaned into him, tasting wine and warmth and hesitation. When they pulled apart, it was with a breath they hadn't realized they were holding. They didn't speak. There was no need to. Claire went to bed that night with her heart beating in a rhythm unfamiliar to her, steady, hopeful, scared. She lay awake, staring at the wooden beams overhead, wondering what exactly had just begun. She didn't know who he truly was, but in his silence, his steadiness, his unexpected tenderness, she had found a space where she could breathe. The next morning dawned pale and cold. Gray left early to check the generator and drive into town for supplies. Claire lingered in the house, wrapped in a sweater too large for her, drinking coffee as she wandered the rooms. She ended up in the library again, drawn to the sense of peace it offered. Her eyes caught on a stack of papers on his desk, neat, structured, clipped together with precision. She hesitated, but something about the header made her pause. Carter Innovations. She frowned. The name struck a distant chord. Her father had cursed that name more than once at the dinner table, in boardrooms, during late-night calls he thought she wasn't listening to. Curiosity overcame discretion. She picked up the top sheet. The page was dense with graphs, projections, brand assessments. At the bottom of the second page, bolded in black, Holloway Group, Competitive Strategy Outline. Her heart stuttered. Her breath caught. She flipped to another document, a report dated 3 months ago, Acquisition Risks and Leverage Points, Holloway Retail Division. It hit her all at once. Grayson. Gray. Grayson Carter. He wasn't just some recluse in the woods with an eye for design and a house full of books. He was Gray Carter, CEO of Carter Innovations, the very man her father had spent the last 5 years calling his most dangerous competitor. The man whose strategies had slowly chipped away at Holloway Group's dominance. The man whose name she had learned to associate with ruthless brilliance, and she had just slept under his roof, kissed him, trusted him. Claire stood there, papers trembling in her hands, the cold seeping back into her bones. Everything she had just begun to believe in unraveled at once. When Gray returned an hour later, whistling faintly and dusted in snow, he found her waiting by the fireplace, a folder in her hands and a look in her eyes that made the warmth in the room vanish. She didn't speak. She simply held up the file. His smile faded, and then, slowly, his expression turned to something unreadable. Resignation, maybe even regret. Claire's voice, when it came, was quiet. "You knew exactly who I was." He didn't answer. Not yet. The silence between them stretched, heavy and thick. And in that moment, everything began to shift. The folder lay between them like a loaded weapon, quiet and accusing. Gray didn't move. His hands remained at his sides, still gloved from the cold outside. Snow melted in droplets along his shoulders, soaking into his coat, but he didn't seem to notice. His eyes were fixed on Claire, no longer soft or warm, but guarded, like a fortress closing its gates. She stood stiffly near the fireplace, her fingers clenched around the documents as if they might burn her if she let them go. The flickering fire behind her cast tall shadows on the walls, and for a moment it seemed like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for one of them to speak. "You knew," she said again, her voice sharper now, the edge of betrayal cutting through it. Gray stepped forward and took off his gloves, dropping them onto the coffee table with a quiet thud. He didn't deny it, didn't offer an explanation. That, more than anything, made her stomach twist. "How long?" she asked, her throat tightening. "How long have you known who I was?" His jaw tightened, and he exhaled slowly. "Yesterday morning. My assistant called, said you disappeared off the radar. Then your last name clicked." Claire laughed, short, bitter. "So you figure the daughter of George Holloway just happened to end up on your doorstep in a snowstorm?" "I didn't plan this," he said. "I didn't know when I found you, I swear. But you kept me here anyway. Let me talk. Let me trust you. Let me believe." She stopped herself, biting back the rising wave of emotion. "You let me feel safe, knowing exactly who I was." Gray's face remained impassive, but something shifted in his eyes. Pain, maybe, or guilt. He crossed the room slowly, deliberately, but stopped when he saw her flinch. It wasn't fear, it was something deeper. The look of someone realizing the shelter they'd found was an illusion. "You think I used you?" he asked. "I don't know what to think," she said. "This, whatever this was, felt real. But I don't know what's real anymore." Gray's voice dropped, quieter. "It was real, at least to me." She shook her head, stepping back. "Then why didn't you tell me? Why not say something the moment you realized?" "Because I didn't want it to end," he admitted. "Because I was afraid that the second I said my name, you'd look at me the way you're looking at me now." Claire swallowed hard, her grip on the folder loosening. It slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor, papers spilling across the rug in a disarrayed fan of strategy and betrayal. She stared down at them, then back at him. "I didn't come here to spy on you," she said. "I didn't even know you lived here. I just wanted to disappear." "I believe you." "Do you?" Her voice cracked slightly. "Because right now it feels like we were both hiding. The difference is, I wasn't hiding with a plan." Gray stepped forward again, this time slowly as if approaching a wounded animal. "Claire, I didn't want this to happen like this. I never meant to deceive you. But you did." The silence that followed was thick and final. The fire hissed and crackled, casting its orange glow on the papers at their feet. Claire looked down at them, then back up at the man she thought she had started to understand. Now, he felt like a stranger again, a powerful name cloaked in warmth and carefully measured silence. "I should go," she said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to rise. Gray didn't try to stop her. He just nodded, slowly, as if he had known this moment was coming since the second he saw her standing there with the folder in her hands. She returned to the guest room and packed quickly, methodically, her fingers trembling only once when she touched the sweater he had lent her. She left it folded neatly on the bed. When she stepped outside, the snow had stopped falling, but the world was still white and silent. The SUV had been pulled back onto the road, its tires now fitted with chains. Of course, he had prepared everything. That's what men like him did. Controlled the narrative, anticipated the ending. He stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching her with unreadable eyes. "I won't say I'm sorry," he said, "because what we shared wasn't a lie." "No," she agreed, "but maybe it wasn't the truth either." She opened the car door, hesitated for just a second, and then climbed in. The engine started without issue. As she pulled away, she didn't look back. The drive was long and quiet. The roads were still slick in places, but the worst of the storm had passed. She reached the town before nightfall and checked into a small roadside inn, registering under a different name. The clerk didn't ask questions. She appreciated that. In the quiet of her room, Claire stared at her reflection in the mirror. Her face looked different, paler, sharper. The girl who had arrived in Vermont seeking solitude was not the same one now curling up beneath the thin hotel blanket. That girl had believed she could escape who she was by running away. This one had learned that names followed you, no matter how deep into the snow you fled. The next morning, she returned to New York. The city welcomed her like a tide returning to shore. Fast, loud, unrelenting. She walked into her father's office without an appointment. His assistant blinked in surprise but didn't stop her. George Holloway looked up from his desk, clearly caught off guard. "Well, well," he said. "The prodigal daughter returns." Claire didn't waste time. She dropped her bag on the chair and folded her arms across her chest. "Did you send someone to follow me?" Her father leaned back in his chair, unbothered. "I had to make sure you were safe. You tend to run off with little regard for the consequences. So it wasn't about me. It was about control. It's always about control, Claire. That's what business is." She shook her head, disgusted. "Did you know I was with Gray Carter?" George's eyebrows lifted just slightly. "Eventually, my people recognized his house. You made things interesting." She laughed, bitter and dry. "You used me. I didn't ask you to go to him, but once you did, I wasn't going to waste the opportunity. You gave us insight." Claire stepped closer, her voice low and cold. "I wasn't a tool for you to wield. I'm not one of your acquisitions. You're my daughter. That's more powerful than any acquisition." "Not anymore." He stilled, studying her. "I'm leaving the company," she said. "I'm done pretending to care about your games." "And what will you do?" he asked, voice mocking. "Paint?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Paint, disappear, whatever it takes not to become you." She turned and left, not waiting for his reply. Outside, the air was sharp with winter. People rushed along the sidewalk, bundled in coats and scarves, unaware that anything had changed. But for Claire, everything had. She had walked into the forest thinking she could be no one. She had walked out knowing exactly who she was, and who she never wanted to be again. Back in his house in Vermont, Gray stood at the same window where she had once stared at the snow. The fire burned low behind him. He hadn't touched the folder since she left. It still lay on the floor, pages scattered like broken promises. He picked up one of the sketches she had left in the library, a small charcoal drawing on thin paper, hastily done, but beautiful. A tree caught in snow, its branches heavy but still standing. He ran a finger along the edge, then folded it carefully and slipped it into the notebook where he kept things he didn't want to forget. She was gone. but her presence lingered in the silence, in the pages, in the warmth that had briefly returned to the house. Gray didn't know if he would ever see her again, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Nothing between them had been pretend. Not the snow, not the silence, not the way she had looked at him when she didn't yet know his name. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to hold on to. The city swallowed her as if she had never left it. Horns blared, lights blinked through the frost-rimmed windows. New York pulsed with the same tireless rhythm Claire had once thought she understood, but now it felt foreign. The sidewalks were crowded with bundled silhouettes, all walking briskly, eyes downcast, their purpose endless. But Claire walked slowly through the streets of Manhattan as if re-entering a world she no longer belonged to. She had returned to the Holloway Tower not because she missed it, but because she needed to say goodbye. The confrontation with her father had ended exactly as she expected, dismissive, transactional, cloaked in the illusion of paternal concern. He had never seen her, not truly, only as an extension of his empire, an asset in need of polish and positioning. She had spent her whole life believing that approval was love, that success was identity. But Gray had shattered that illusion, not through deception, but through honesty she hadn't known she craved. Leaving was easier than she thought it would be. Claire didn't pack her things from the family apartment. She left the key on the counter. Her name had never felt like hers there. The next day, she signed a short-term lease for a modest studio on the outskirts of Brooklyn, a top-floor walk-up with the creaking floorboards and windows that rattled in the wind. There was no doorman, no curated marble lobby, but the light in the mornings was beautiful, and for the first time her life felt like her own. She spent the first few weeks in silence, letting the noise of the past fall away. No press releases, no meetings, no carefully rehearsed statements. She bought a second-hand easel, a set of oils, and started to paint the images that had haunted her since Vermont. Branches heavy with snow, flames dancing in stone fireplaces, shadows cast by candlelight. And always, somewhere in the background, the outline of a man whose face she refused to render, because to do so would make him more real than she could bear. Her paintings were not polished. They were raw, urgent, emotional. She painted late into the night, music playing softly, the city a distant murmur beyond her windows. She signed her work with the name Hollow, not her real name, but a piece of it. It felt honest. A woman hollowed out by a legacy, finally choosing to fill the space with something of her own. One of her pieces, a snowy forest tinged with crimson and gold, caught the eye of a gallery intern who happened upon her work online. Claire hesitated when she was contacted. The world she had fled, the world of image and approval, now beckoned her again, but this time under a new light. Anonymity had given her voice. And so she agreed, under the condition that her true name remain hidden. She let the painting go. It sold within a week. The buyer paid in cash, anonymously. She didn't know it yet, but Gray had seen the piece through a quiet connection, a whispered recommendation from a former art advisor who thought it might speak to him. When he saw the brushstrokes, the way the snow bled into the trees, the way the light twisted through the branches, he had known. Not logically, not intellectually, but in the place just beneath the ribs where memory lingered. He bought it without asking the artist's name. He placed it in the room where she had once read by the fire, angled so the morning light would strike it just right. Sometimes he stood before it for minutes, sometimes for hours. It was the only piece of art in his house that didn't come from a catalog or a gallery he had acquired. It was the only piece that made him feel anything when he looked at it. Gray didn't leave Vermont often now. The house felt both emptier and fuller in her absence. Her presence lingered in strange places. The way she had folded the blankets, the faint scent of jasmine on a pillow she had slept on, a forgotten hair tie resting on the edge of the sink. He had nearly tossed it once, then stopped himself. It sat now in the drawer beside his bed, next to the folded sketch of the snow-covered tree she had drawn and left behind. He had tried to write to her, more than once. Pages began with purpose and ended in uncertainty. What could he say that would not sound like justification? What words could rebuild something fractured by circumstance and silence? In the end, he wrote nothing, said nothing, bought a painting and held it like a message never sent. Months passed. Winter surrendered slowly to the hesitant thaw of early spring. The snow receded, revealing wet sidewalks and flower beds bruised by ice. Claire painted more, sold more, but stayed hidden. She watched the world return to motion from the safety of her studio, each day a quiet rebellion against the life she had been raised to follow. Then came the invitation. A private auction, charity-based, small, prestigious, discreet. The gallery that had represented her work asked if she would be willing to attend in person, even anonymously. Her art was garnering attention, and patrons wanted to meet the mind behind the mystery. Claire almost declined, but something in her paused. It wasn't about fame. It wasn't about the sale. It was a chance to stand in a room as herself, even if no one knew who she truly was. She wore black, a simple dress, elegant but unremarkable. Her hair was pulled back loosely. No makeup, no mask. She walked into the event with quiet purpose, her heels clicking against marble, her heartbeat thudding like a drum. The gallery was sleek and modern, glass and steel offset by warm lighting. The paintings hung along the walls like memories suspended in time. Her piece, a new one, titled "What the Fire Left," hung near the center. It was the most personal one yet. A single chair before a dying hearth. A window open to falling snow. An empty cup on a table. The sense of someone just departed, or perhaps someone about to return. She stood at a distance, watching patrons pause and murmur. No one knew who she was. That was the point. And then she saw him. Gray. He was standing before the painting, still and quiet, dressed in a dark suit, his hair slightly longer, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. He didn't move, didn't speak, just studied the painting with the kind of intensity she remembered from the fireplace, from the way he had once looked at her across candlelight. Claire stepped forward, slowly, uncertain if she would stay frozen forever if she didn't. He turned before she reached him. Their eyes met. She expected shock, or awkwardness, or apology, but there was only recognition, and something softer beneath it, relief. "I wondered if you'd be here," he said quietly. "I almost didn't come," she replied. They stood together, side by side, before the painting. "It's yours?" he asked, though he knew the answer. She nodded. He glanced at it again, then at her. "I knew. The second I saw it, just like the first one." Claire looked away, heart hammering. "You bought it?" "Yes." She turned to face him fully. "Why?" He hesitated, then said, "Because it reminded me of something I didn't want to forget." They were quiet again. The murmur of the gallery around them faded into the background. "I hated you," she said at last, "for not stopping me, for letting me believe it was all a lie." "I didn't know how to stop you," he said, "and I was afraid that if I tried, It would only prove your worst fears. It did anyway. I know. Claire took a breath, the air in the room suddenly too warm. So why are you here now? Gray looked at her, his gaze steady, unflinching. Because I needed to know if you were still painting, he said. And because if there was any chance I could see you again, I had to take it. She didn't respond right away. She stared at the painting instead, her own vulnerability staring back at her from the canvas. I don't know if I can trust you, she whispered. I don't know if I deserve it, he said, but I never lied about how I felt. That part was always true. Claire turned back to him. You said once that you wished you didn't know how much power changes people, she said. He nodded. Maybe it's not about forgetting, she said softly. Maybe it's about choosing something else. His lips parted slightly. Like what? Like this, she said, showing up, without strategy, without a name. She didn't smile, but her hand, when it reached for his, didn't tremble. He took it in his, warm and sure, and in that moment, surrounded by strangers and silence, the snow inside her heart began to melt. They left together, unnoticed by most, remembered by none. But for them, it was enough. Outside, snow flurried lightly, more rain than ice now, the last breath of a winter finally learning how to let go. Subscribe for more stories like this. Watch the next video to keep going. And if this one spoke to you, share it.